morning, everyone, and welcome to Nela Drury's Capstone Defense. So congratulations, Nela, for getting to this point. We're all very happy to be here with you. My name is Dr. Alex Sevigny. I'm the Capstone Defense Committee Chair for today. And that means I'm going to run today's meeting. A couple of rules of the road. Nela will present for approximately 25 minutes. If you go over, don't worry. We're not going to, shut you down. Just try to respect the 25-minute limit. After that, there'll be a round of questions. We'll start with Nela's supervisor, followed by, her second reader. And I have the opportunity to ask questions if I wish as chair. We'll go through a second round of questions after that. And after the end of the committee's round of questions, we will go to the gallery. So people in the gallery, sharpen your pencils, get ready to ask questions. Sometimes the most challenging or most interesting questions come from friends and family or other students. So don't hesitate. You're also allowed to make comments if you wish, of course. At the end of that period, we will then put everybody into a room except for the committee, and we will deliberate for about 5 minutes, perhaps 7 minutes, something like that. And then we will come back with a result. So it's now 8:01 a.m. So Nela, you have until 8:26 roughly, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. Good morning, and thank you to all of you for joining me bright and early today as I defend my MCM capstone titled Navigating Disruption, the Media Landscape, and Other Disruptive Changes Impacting PR Functions in Canada. I'd like to take a moment before I start to thank Dr. Terry Flynn, our program director, professor, and my second reader for all of his support throughout my time in the program and for being the one to walk me off the ledge when I needed it most. Thank you to Dr. Alex Sevigny for being here today and for all of his support as both a professor and the chair of the committee. I extend my deep gratitude to my capstone advisor, Dave Scholes, who believed in my idea from the start and whose guidance, patience, encouragement, humor, did I say patience, shine the light to the end of the tunnel. To my MCM cohort, it has been a privilege to shoot the puck with you, learn from you, and grow alongside you. I will cherish those friendships forever. And finally, thank you to my husband, my mom, my dad, and my business partner, Theo. I would not be here without you. So here is what I'll be walking us through today. We'll start with the context for the study, followed by the literature review. I will share the research problem and questions that guided the study. I'll dive into the methodology and the study's sample, walk us through the findings and the analysis, the good part. Of course, we'll discuss limitations, suggested areas for future research, and then we'll wrap it up. A time of unprecedented change. We truly are living in this time of unprecedented change, and as a budding PR professional, an agency owner, and a future MCM grad, fingers crossed, that both excites me, but it also really scares me because for our public relations functions to survive, we need to adapt. And to adapt, we need to understand the changes around us. The only research that had been done on this topic of what emerging changes are impacting PR was recent and led by Dr. Terry Flynn and my peer Sabrina Lavie. So I was inspired to build on this research while also keeping in mind that this would be a moment in time snapshot of our current reality and that the study could be repeated in the future. In my literature review, I looked at public relations through the lens of disruption and found that while PR is obviously being disrupted, it is also disruptive in its nature because it is most successful as an integrated function as per Grunig. And in order for it to become integrated, it has to disrupt an organization. With disruptive change, I learned that the perception of upheaval really dictates how it is being treated, what resources are being put towards it, if it is viewed as good or bad as per Gilbert and Bauer. And this is much like a comms crisis. And so there's definitely opportunity to shape the narrative around disruptive change. Now, to the right of the screen, you'll see 3 topics I took deep dives into. lots of information available out there about how the media landscape is shrinking and the changing revenue models over time. Mark Edge has written about this for years, as well as how trust in news is decreasing, as seen in the most recent Reuters digital report and the Edelman Trust Barometer, and so on. And all of this is underpinned in Canada, particularly by regulatory challenges that have, in some cases, enabled the issues we face today. And again, I referenced lots of Mark Edge's literature on this topic. Misinformation and disinformation having exploded around the pandemic and continuing to create these echo chambers of like-minded people on social media and in real life, significantly impacting public perception and trust to this day. The misinformation review out of Harvard was a useful tool here, as well as some of Dan Tish's research pre-2020. And lastly, the deep, deep impact of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll be referring to this as JEDI for short throughout the presentation, which came to the forefront of public discourse in 2020, and the impacts of how things like woke washing have bred inauthenticity. So here I referenced folks like Danielle Warren, who is credited with really defining woke washing. And I also underpinned that more recent research with Baumburns' literature on key drivers of corporate reputation. Shout out to Jackie Hornweg's reputation class, including authenticity, which plays a really key role in woke washing and how we approach JEDI. So the combination of this contextual thinking and the research showing that there are so many disruptors led me to this broader and exploratory research problem, which asked how and to what extent disruptive changes are impacting the PR industry in Canada. As for research questions, question 1 was used to determine the what. So looking at what disruptive changes are most impacting public relations in Canada. Question 2 asked how and to what extent the top disruptive change is currently impacting PR functions, the keyword being current. And question 3 is where I asked folks to take out their crystal ball and tell me how they believe, how and to what extent, the top disruptive change is shaping the future of PR functions. Excuse me. So the study leveraged mixed method research, which included a thematic literature review, a survey, and interviews. After my lit review was complete, I issued a survey that presented key disruptive changes, including those discovered by Dr. Flynn and Sabrina Labby and those discovered through the literature review. The survey is what enabled me to define the top disruptors overall and in each sector. After that, the in-depth interviews then worked to generate a qualitative data about how the top disruptors identified through the survey are impacting sectors. So interviews were asked about the top 2 disruptors specific to their sector. The sample of both survey respondents and interviewees was made up of PR leaders in Canada who had to meet the qualifying criteria of having held a management or executive position for a minimum of 1 year. And lastly, that sample was recruited using convenience, volunteer, purposive, and snowball methods. So research question 1 findings. What we're looking at here are survey results indicating the top disruptive changes across all sectors. So as I mentioned, how the disruptors were presented here based on previous research. And looking at the results, it's easy to see the top 3 disruptors were 1, the media landscape, followed by mis and disinformation, and finally, generative AI. When we look at the top 2 disruptors indicated by each sector, we can see that the media landscape remains the top choice. In the public sector, it was actually tied with JEDI. Mis and disinformation came through as the second most disruptive change in public and nonprofit sectors, while generative AI was the second most disruptive change in the private sector. Now, because the media landscape was the top disruptor, both overall and in each sector, the study took a deeper dive into it, while also noting if and how competing disruptors may be contributing to the impacts. Now, looking at research question 2, this asked how and to what extent does the top disruptive change impact PR functions in Canada? You'll see even just by glancing at this table that in every sector, the level of disruption is high or very high, and that the description of the disruption is negative or somewhat negative. And so again, this is just looking at the media landscape. Based on what I learned from the interviews, the major impacts felt by the private sector included things like audience fragmentation, meaning that with the disappearance of media outlets, the sector is losing a comms vehicle to their audiences. So their audiences are looking in various places for information. And with the audience fragmenting in this way, it is more challenging to communicate with them. The sector also noted a perceived change in how their audiences value media, specifically earned media pieces. This was notably different between interviewees who work in-house and think the value of earned media has gone down, and those who work in agency who think the value has gone up. In terms of increased competition, factors like there being less journalists to pitch to, but just as many stories to be told, if not more, and less journalists who intimately understand your subject matter were issues that were cited throughout the public sector. Looking at that was the private sector we just discussed. Now, looking at the public sector, interviewees shared an increased pressure to demonstrate accountability and beyond that authenticity, and we'll talk about why in the analysis. The public sector also noted their audience as being fragmented. However, the pressures had to do with building skills to reach those audiences wherever they had moved, as well as learning to leverage their existing corporate comms channels more effectively, including things like web and social media. Finally, in nonprofit, the disappearance of media outlets has had a profound impact on community nonprofits as they're now struggling to raise awareness about what they're doing, and namely how they're spending donor dollars, which has a very real impact on operational goals in a nonprofit setting. Lastly, and I found this very interesting, with the disappearance of some community papers, nonprofits are seeing more independent journalists at a community level that are putting their own spin on stories. In other words, spreading misinformation or perhaps even disinformation. And that's creating major polarization in some communities. Now, part of how I approached answering research question 2 was to understand the levels of anxiety and stress associated with a disruptor, and then compare that to the levels of preparedness to actually address the disruptor. So starting with the private sector, there was a high level of anxiety and stress associated with the impacts of the Canadian media landscape. In fact, the levels were highest in the private sector. We also see a notable gap between that result and the relatively low level of preparedness to address the disruptor, with the majority of survey respondents indicating they felt either unprepared or only somewhat prepared. In the public sector, the anxiety and stress levels are somewhat high. However, the level of preparedness was more varied, ranging from somewhat prepared to very unprepared. Lastly, the nonprofit sector results on this topic were inconclusive and therefore omitted from the section of this presentation, in case you're wondering. Now, the findings from research question 3, I'm calling this slide the nuances of negative impacts. And of course, question 3 examined how and to what extent the top disruptive change is shaping future public relations functions. So I had asked survey respondents to describe what they predict will be the impacts of the media landscape in the short term, so over the next year, and in the medium term, so the next 1 to 3 years. And the arrows you're looking at here indicate trends per sector. However, again, nuances of negativity across the board. In the private sector, the impacts over the 1-year mark, which you see there at the top of the arrow, 80 were somewhat negative and negative. And then over the 1 to 3 year mark, which you see at the bottom of the arrow, 85% of respondents describe the impact as negative. So we see a substantial downward trend, and the trend is actually strongest in the private sector. Now, the public sector was split between somewhat negative and very negative at the 1-year mark. And then we saw that very negative disruptor turn to just plain negative. So that's why we're seeing an upward trend, however, very much still in the realm of negative impacts. And lastly, in the nonprofit sector, there was no change from the 1 to 3 year marks, with the description of impact being somewhat negative. Another way I chose to examine the impacts was from the lens of budget and HR in this case referring to PR staffing levels such as internal and external staff. So I asked if respondents believed the media landscape would reduce the need for PR human resources in the medium term, and the results were quite different across each sector. The private sector believed that PR roles would be reduced, the public sector did not, and the nonprofit sector was split. However, there is more consensus when we look at predicted budgetary needs for PR functions, with every sector showing a level of agreement that budget will be needed within PR functions to address the impacts of the media landscape. We'll look at the correlations here in the analysis section of the presentation. So while my study did focus on that top disruptor, the media landscape, it also looked at other disruptors that came in near the top in terms of their impact. As we've discussed, media landscape is predicted to have more negative impacts over the 1 to 3 year mark, presented by the downward arrow again. Unfortunately, this was also the case with mis and disinformation. However, the story with generative AI was totally different. Over the 1 year period, the predicted impacts are somewhat positive, and over the 1 to 3 year period, there was a slight increase in positive description. So all to say, not all disruptive change is perceived negatively by the PR community. Now, looking at the HR and budgetary predictions from the cross-sector lens here, survey respondents agreed that the media landscape may reduce the need for PR human resources. However, they strongly agreed in a budget increase for PR functions. Again, we'll look at why in the analysis. With mis and disinformation, we see strong disagreement that this disruptor will reduce the need for PR human resources and agreement that more budget will be required. Finally, with generative AI, we see various levels of agreement that the disruptor will reduce the need for PR human resources, but also agreement that budgets will need to increase. So interesting results here that we will dive into in the analysis. Starting now. So what does it all mean? Using the cross-sector lens and looking at the media landscape, the impacts are negative right now and are predicted to increase in the medium term. We know that not a single sector believes they are prepared to address the impacts, and the predictions of what HR and budgets are needed to address impact are varied. While this does tell a story on its own, there is so much more to it if we look at the results per sector. And for the sake of keeping to time constraints of this presentation, I'll take a deeper dive into the private and public sectors only. Excuse me. So the private sector holds a high level of stress and anxiety around the disruption, and that correlates to the sector holding the most negative view of future impacts. The sector also predicts a decreased need for PR human resources, but they predict the PR budget will either stay the same or need to go up. Interviews revealed the uptake of varied PR tactics as the use of media relations tactics decrease included things like generative AI and paid media, so leaning on the peso model. And because we know that the sector feels positively about generative AI's impacts on PR functions, using all of this data, we can conclude that the sector's increased budget may go towards PR tactics that don't necessitate PR human resources or human labor for that matter. Now, looking at the public sector, the levels of anxiety and stress were not as high, and we see their negative view on the disruption predicted to slightly improve over the medium term. A potential reason that came through in interviews is this ongoing presence of beat reporters and journalists that cover major public sector topics like health and education. However, it should be noted that there was a lack of third-party research available to corroborate whether journalists covering public sector beats are being laid off less than other beat journalists, for instance. There's also disagreement that the PR human resources will decrease, and strong agreement, 80% to be exact, that PR budgets should increase. These findings reflect the public sector's magnified challenge in creating trust with their audiences, particularly after this period of significant disruption with justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll remind us that in the public sector, the media landscape and JEDI were both equally identified as the top disruptor. Systemic inequities are entrenched in Canadian institutions and rooted in its colonial past. So the public sector faces pressure to demonstrate accountability towards their statements and use of tax dollars. And the risk and costs of woke washing are very high. And so it wasn't surprising to me that the sector anticipates needing ongoing PR support. Now, the limitations of my humble study included the fact that many private sector respondents work in agency, which makes the result more likely to be applicable to PR pros in this industry. A likely reason for this occurring is because I myself am an agency owner and therefore have a larger network in this industry. Moreover, the depth of qualitative data in particular collected during the interviews limited the strength of the overall analysis of the paper. Interviewees were only asked about the top 2 disruptive changes impacting their sector, and qualitative research on the impacts of misinformation and disinformation and generative AI on the public and nonprofit sectors is limited. In addition, this study was a moment in time snapshot, as I've mentioned, providing an overview of the prevailing disruptive changes impacting PR in early 2024. It is essential to recognize that forthcoming disruptions will undoubtedly impact us, and the outcomes of this study would potentially and even likely yield varying outcomes if the study were to be replicated in the future. And I'll mention one more thing that's not on the screen right now, but that's the sample size. And the sample size isn't huge. However, I think that it gives us a comprehensive picture of some of the top line trends. And should this study be repeated, I would highly recommend a larger sample size. And the result of that really, or the reason for that, was time limits and resource limits of myself as a researcher. So future research, the paper covers more areas for future research, but here I'll share what I think is most pertinent and particularly what's most time sensitive. So media fragmentation is leading to audience fragmentation, and that was revealed as a significant output of the top disruptive change. Therefore, future research could explore how fragmentation is impacting audience behavior, particularly in how different demographic groups are accessing and trusting various media sources. And that research could support PR functions in devising more targeted and effective strategies to reach their various publics and audiences. This also poses challenges in measuring the impact of PR campaigns. Therefore, future research could focus on developing or improving analytics tools to measure engagement and impact across various digital platforms that would help organizations to better understand and reach their fragmented audiences. So these were the most time-sensitive areas of future research that I would suggest. So in conclusion, I want to take us back to this idea of a time of unprecedented change. PR in Canada is undergoing a significant metamorphosis that is driven by disruptive changes like the ones I shared today. The private sector is grappling with maintaining media relationships and adapting to decreases in traditional media. The public sector is confronting the demand for greater authenticity. And nonprofit organizations, meanwhile, are struggling with resource limitations and misinformation and disinformation as a byproduct of the shrinking media landscape. And so this study captured a moment in time for Canadian PR practitioners, shedding light on the challenges and opportunities ahead. In anticipating an increase in such challenges, I would say it's critical that we remain attentive in identifying and managing these disruptors, including through proactive analysis and also integration into our crisis management strategies and plans. Finally, my hope is that this study serves as a call to cultivate a deeper understanding of this rapidly changing environment and for us to continue diversifying public relations strategies and adapting. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I will now gladly take your questions.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Nela. And without further ado, I'm going to ask your supervisor, Mr. Schultz, to kick off the questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Excellent work, Nela. Well done. So let me jump in with your last slide talks about this being unprecedented disruptions. I'm going to challenge you on that statement a little bit. Is that not an egocentric approach where our generation thinks what's going on is the unprecedented change and disruption? And back when the Gutenberg press was invented, that was an unprecedented change at that time. When television came around, that was an unprecedented change. So what makes this unprecedented and so disruptive right now?
Well, egotistical maybe, but I think that every generation thinks that what they are going through is unprecedented. And that may be true. And that perception is in the eye of those people who are experiencing it. However, what does make the current day truly unprecedented is this presence of the digital world and also the rapid technology that truly is moving at a pace and developing at a pace that it has never developed before. And so what that has done is opened up so many different information sharing channels and channels for us to communicate, and they are growing every single day. And so, with the Gutenberg press, for instance, that was a channel for communication. That's one channel, right? And so today, on a daily basis, those channels are opening and duplicating and replicating. So that's why I would say this is truly an unprecedented time. To add to that, with that technology, we've also brought automation. So the kind of porous nature of the technology, it's absorbing information, it is learning from information, and now we have systems like generative AI that are accessible to everyone. So that is also causing these ripple effects that we're seeing, like misinformation and disinformation. So I would also say that the risks are so much higher today because everyone has access to these systems. So in that way, I think the risk factor, the level of technology that we have at our fingertips, and the rapid growth and development of technology are all factors that truly make this an unprecedented time.
And I like that your list of disruptors isn't just all negative. I mean, generative AI is, some see it as negative, but it's potentially very positive. And I know you touched on this in your presentation, but maybe you can go back and just expand on it a bit. How did you come up with that list of disruptors, like, to test and do your survey and talk to your interview respondents about?
Certainly. So I had a very solid starting point. And I leaned on Dr. Flynn and Sabrina Lavi's research. And these were impacts to PR leaders. And so I did a literature review both on those factors just for my own knowledge to understand whether or not they are still timely. And then in addition, I did really in-depth research to understand what the additional factors are. So altogether, I've included disruptors that were found from my own literature review, as well as from the study on impacting leaders. And that was the combination of the disruptors that were offered to survey respondents. In addition, I had a portion of that list where a respondent could input a disruptive change that they may think is impacting them that isn't on the list. So in that way, I made sure that we aren't omitting a disruptive change. And the interesting thing is that not a single person of the 52 respondents inputted a different disruptive change. So I feel confident that we did cover them.
Okay, thank you, Nela. Dr.
Okay.
Flynn?
Congratulations, Nela. Excellent presentation. Very interesting study to really kind of get at what's going on, not only in the industry, but what's happening in the world as well. I want to, and the JEDI, I'd never heard of that before. That's, I'm of two minds on that because it just harkens back to Star Wars. And
Yes.
I think I think that it's a pretty serious issue. And just this week, we heard that there are campaigns in the United States that says DEI equals DIE. So, this notion of wake washing and trying to, say that the work that is happening within the progressive movement was not meaningful. Anyways, but that's not the question I have. Question I really have is about your methodology, and especially your qualitative panel, the 10 people that you interviewed with them. I don't see a lot of description about them in your paper. Can you tell me about that? Who are they? Where are they from? Not their names, but who are they? Where are they from? What kind of positions they held? Gender issues as well.
Well, I'm bound by the ethics board, so I will share what I can about the interviewees. I made a conscious effort to choose people from different industries. So when I looked at the survey respondents, I did ask folks to choose their industry, and that list was based on what the census uses. So in the private sector, we had a mix of 2 folks in agency, and 1 person in the financial sector, and another in the utilities industry, rather. So that was the mix there. And the reason I chose to go with 2 folks from agencies because it was also very overrepresented in the survey respondents. So there was a balance there. The remaining 6, we had folks from community nonprofits and government nonprofits. And then in the public sector, we had someone from government, education, and health. So I really did my best to diversify who we were speaking to. And because I was aiming for 10, I went with the 4 in private sector because ultimately the private sector was a larger chunk, and it is a larger chunk really of our economy, right? So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it gives me a better sense. How many would have been from the MCM community?
Am I allowed to answer that question?
Yeah,
With the
yeah,
ethics
because
board? Okay.
you're not telling us who they are.
No, it's not a trick question. I would say a third.
Okay. So my concern was that we're reporting on too much inside baseball kind of stuff, and that
Yeah.
our networks and the people that we talk to with these are people who are already primed for some of the issues that are happening within it. But the key is to be able to get beyond that as well. The other thing on your methodologies, originally when I went back and looked at your proposal that you did for me last summer, you were hoping to have 150 participants in the survey, and then 15 people, 5 from certain sectors as well, or 3 from certain. So what happened with the survey?
So the survey was in market for 2 weeks. And there was, a big push on LinkedIn. I put a little bit of, boost money behind my LinkedIn just to spread it across LinkedIn as much as possible. And it was reshared by a lot of people. So I was really grateful for that. I sent it to, various people over LinkedIn. I had over 100 responses, but only 52 were usable. And so that was the interesting thing, that I think limitations in my own skills as a survey builder, but perhaps also in using Lime Survey. I believe what happened was that, if you hadn't selected the consent in the beginning, you still could have filled it out. But of course, I cannot use it if you don't consent, or if you don't meet the qualifying criteria. And so qualifying criteria and consent were grouped into one question, because they all had to be a yes. And I think that's where some of that disconnect happened. So that's one reason, I think a technical reason. The other thing too is that the sample I was going for is a very particular subset of people in PR. They have to be PR leaders. They have to have held a management or executive level position in public relations for 3 years. For 1 year, and to have worked in PR for 3 years. So I think that limited the pool that I had to pick from. Just thinking if there was anything else. Those are the major reasons I would say why that was the case. And to be perfectly honest, time constraints for myself as a professional obviously played a role as well. So I'm happy with what I was able to pull together, but I recognize that if this was to be repeated, it should be at a much larger scale so we get a more fulsome picture.
You had a disruptive change in your original schedule, right? Apparently you got married or something like that, went on a honeymoon. How can
I
you
did.
do that? Where is your focus, Nela?
It was so disruptive. It was unbelievable.
I blame Alec for that. So
You do.
not
Well, he's
Alex,
right
not
here.
Alex X, Alex C.
Alex.
Yeah.
Yes, you're good. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
All to him.
Okay. Over to Alex. Alexandre.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question myself as well. I'm curious to know what are your next steps with this research? How are you gonna mobilize this knowledge that you've gathered?
So I have committed to sharing some of the results on my LinkedIn. I think, as a budding professional, I am doing everything I can to build up my LinkedIn and to really hone that space for myself and as a networker as well. So that will be step one. In terms of spreading the word, I would love the opportunity to apply to a few conferences. I know CPRS isn't really on the table this year because it coincides with our graduation, which hopefully I will be at. Beyond that, I would love to apply for some conferences next year because I think that even in a year's time, this will be still very, very timely. And perhaps even doing some additional interviews to then corroborate if there's been any changes next year. But really, my dream big moment with this study was to create a survey, which Dave was so supportive with, something that could be replicated in the future. And, allow me to just dream big. You look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, you look at, there's a few others, but it's a study that gets replicated and then you capture this moment in time. And so this is to a very, very small scale, a part of a bigger dream. So for me, it's about taking that pulse. And the other thing I'll share too is, because I work in agency, I don't have the privilege of understanding how an in-house PR team, comms team is being impacted by these changes. So it was really educational for me to understand how these folks are being impacted. It'll make me a better professional in agency and hopefully more ready if I do work in-house someday. So that's a little bit about my ideology behind it and also how I'd like to share it in the future.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that. It sounds like a good. You have a lot of thoughts on where to go next with this. This is great.
I will be knocking on your doors. Thank you, Alex.
Well, you're always welcome. So we'll go back to Dave and Terry for a second round, and then we'll open it up to the gallery for any questions.
Yeah, I have one more question, and it's going to build on what you just said. So the Edelman Trust Barometer is a great way to look at trust overall, but then Edelman goes in and offers a lot of consultative services around that. So if we take the Drury disruption indicator, which I just branded for you,
Love it.
and you're doing this work, and I might be a CSO of an agency. What can you tell me? How do I prepare? Because one of your slides, you talked about there's a low level of preparedness in the private sector. What are some advice you would give me to start preparing for upcoming disruptions?
And so would you like a sector specific answer or an overall methodology of how to approach?
Anything that works and makes everyone seem like you've answered the question appropriately.
Got it. So that's a great question because I've thought about what that could look like as a service. And I think that it all begins with understanding the issues very intimately. So I think the first thing I would suggest as a practitioner is to start in your own backyard, really understand what is going on in your organization through research, through, interviews and surveys, perhaps a focus group to take a pulse of what's going on. And then perhaps look at some secondary research to take a look at how is this related to what is going on in the outside world. So that would be my number one. Number two, you can reference my research and look at some of those top line disruptors. So for instance, with audience fragmentation, there's a point right there where you could choose to devote some of your budget and resources to better understanding where have your audiences dispersed, because without knowing where they are, we can't talk to them. So that would be maybe if they're looking for an immediate silver bullet solution to one of the issues, there's one. Or for instance, looking at, however, I'm just trying to think of another one of the recommendations that I made in the paper, but I'm drawing a blank. So that would be one thing that we could do. I would say start with the research internally, compare it to what's going on outside, and then really make an action plan that goes beyond just saying we're going to fix the problem. Here's how we're going to fix the problem. There has to be a multi-year strategy, and that has to be embedded in your organization. It cannot be a piecemeal thing that's being done. Otherwise, it just will not be effective. So that would be how I would approach it. And then, of course, we need to measure that effectiveness down the line. So pick a cadence to measure it, have a plan for how we're going to keep adjusting to make sure that the problem is being solved, and also have your PR team environmentally scanning, because while we focus on disruptor A, disruptor F and G are out there, and they might be coming knocking on your door. So I think that would be my overall methodology.
Thank you, Nela.
My pleasure.
So last week, Dave and I happened to be at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington and heard two presentations, one by Michelle Rousseau, who's the CCO of the Chamber, talk about the language of business and how language has to change, because people don't trust big business, but they trust local business, and they trust things local. And then Doug Pinkham from the Public Affairs Council talked about this issue of trust as well. And while there is huge disruption happening within the media landscape, and the communities have news deserts now because there is nothing there. The interesting research that both those surveys talked about is that people trust their local media, and yet there's no local media. So it's a disruption, but it could be a positive disruption. So how can the industry help local media or the media ecology address this issue of trust is more important at local than at global scale?
Ooh, this is a tough question, because obviously there are resources that the business community could funnel towards local outlets and publications to support them. But then that raises the question of how much is, X and Y business influencing what this outlet is talking about, right? So I think there's a certain transparency when we know that a piece of media is paid. And so perhaps leveraging that model might be a better way than having a business community sponsor an entire paper. I think that would be maybe a better way to do it. But I kind of want to challenge that notion, because the Edelman Trust Barometer this year, they also talked about how people trust people like them, and they trust their own online searches a lot more. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, the trust level is highest there, like even higher than it is with local papers. I'll just have to double check, but that, if my memory serves me right. So there's a sense of insulating that happens, right, when we start talking to people who think like us and trusting our own research over the research of other people. So I think it's really difficult to break out of that. And I would actually put some onus on the business community, because they have the resources to try to fix this problem. And at the end of the day, I do believe that a public that trusts, its own Google searches more than a lot of things would, and is trusting its government less and less, would be better positioned to, read a paper that's funded by a big business than that's funded by a government. in today's day and age. So I do think that there's an opportunity there, but I would say stick to the paid per piece model rather than sponsoring an entire paper, if that makes sense.
Thanks. Alex, to you.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting last question. I could go on with it, but we were short on time, so I want to just open it up to the gallery and see if anybody has any questions or comments for Nela.
Surely not.
Our galleries have been remarkably silent the last several capstones. This is very highly unusual. They were usually
Is it?
pretty
No, I think
well.
they-
Yeah. We've had some pretty interesting questions.
They have
come
a
in.
secret. They have some kind of secret kind of agreement, right? Because I would think that Maggie and Muhabo would be the first ones to ask the questions, given that they're the next ones up.
I'm
Yeah.
happy to answer any questions.
Okay.
Well, not seeing any questions from the gallery. I'm just going to check the chat to make sure there's nothing there. Nope, no questions there. Oh, go Nela, go. There you go. That's a nice comment. Oh, and it's got some comments coming in from Maggie and others. So what we will do, I guess, is we will put everybody in a room now, and the committee will deliberate for a few minutes, for maybe 5 or 7 minutes. So don't leave, folks. And then we will reconvene to convey the result.
Thank you.